He had always been different from the other kids. While they ran around, shouting and playing rough games in the forest near his town, he preferred to sit quietly, reading books under the shade of a tree or scribbling notes about strange things he noticed in the world. People often called him nerdy, strange, or awkward, and most of the time, he accepted it because he liked the safety of his own thoughts. The world to him was a puzzle, a story, and a library all at once. One late afternoon, the air was still, almost unnaturally so, and a light fog was settling over the forest. He had wandered farther than usual, chasing after an unusual bird he had seen, a bird that seemed too big and too bright for any ordinary forest. He followed it carefully, stepping lightly on fallen leaves, barely making a sound. At first, it seemed like a normal adventure. He reminded himself to be careful, but curiosity pulled him deeper into the trees. The forest around him grew darker, the sunlight struggling to pass through the thick canopy above. Strange noises echoed through the branches' rustling leaves, distant snaps, and a low, almost whispering hiss that he couldn't identify. His heart beat faster, but not with fear. He was fascinated. He had read countless books about strange creatures and alien worlds, and part of him hoped he would stumble upon something extraordinary. He didn't notice the shadows that moved just beyond his vision, silent and deliberate. One moment, he was alone. The next, he felt a presence, heavy and cold, pressing in from every direction. Before he could even react, strong arms, scaly and surprisingly warm, gripped him. They lifted him effortlessly off the ground. The forest blurred as he was carried, his books and notes falling to the moss below. He kicked and struggled, but the creature's grip was unbreakable. The creatures themselves were unlike anything he had ever imagined. Their bodies were long, sleek, and covered in shimmering scales that seemed to change color depending on the light. Their heads were narrow and snake-like, with sharp, glowing eyes that made his skin crawl. He realized they weren't ordinary animals. They were intelligent, their movements coordinated, and there was an almost otherworldly intelligence in their gaze. They moved quickly, faster than he could process. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to escape, but he could barely think. The forest floor whipped past, branches scraping his clothes and hair, and he could smell a strange metallic scent mixed with earth and moss. It was terrifying, but also strangely exciting. He had read about alien life, about worlds beyond Earth, but he had never thought he would encounter anything like this in his lifetime. After what felt like hours, but could have been mere minutes, they reached a hidden entrance partially covered by thick vines and shadows. Without hesitation, they pushed him inside. The entrance was narrow, twisting, and dark. He stumbled, barely keeping his balance, as he was led down a steep, uneven tunnel. His hands scraped against cold, smooth stone, and the hiss of unseen creatures echoed around him. He tried to make sense of it, tried to map the place in his mind, like he had read in survival guides. But nothing in his books could prepare him for this. Finally, the tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber. The space was enormous, dimly lit by faint, glowing orbs that hovered in midair. The walls were slick with moisture, and enormous snakes coiled and slithered across the floor. Their scales reflected the faint light in eerie patterns, making the room look almost alive. Some of the snakes were enormous, easily 10 times his size, and their eyes followed him with uncanny attention. He froze in the center of the chamber, every muscle tight, every sense screaming danger. The aliens released him, and he stumbled to the floor, his knees hitting the cold stone. The snakes moved around him, some rising up to tower over him, their tongues flicking, tasting the air. His mind raced. This wasn't just a dungeon. This was a prison, a lair, and he was completely alone except for the creatures watching him. He wanted to scream, to call for help, but his voice stuck in his throat. He realized that no one on the surface would hear him. Even if he managed to escape, he had no idea where he was or what these creatures wanted. He could feel the air vibrating with their presence, a constant tension that made his skin crawl. It was the kind of fear that settled into your bones, the kind that made your hands shake and your heart pound so hard you could almost hear it dot. And yet, despite the terror, he noticed something else. The snakes didn't attack him immediately. They circled, hissed softly, but none lunged. Their movements were careful, deliberate, as if they were studying him as much as he was studying them. It was confusing. He had expected monsters, killers, something mindless and dangerous, but these creatures were intelligent. Their eyes held a kind of curiosity. He realized that if he wanted to survive, he needed to understand them, to learn what they wanted or feared. He tried to move slowly, keeping his hands in front of him. Every small sound he made seemed amplified in the chamber. The scrape of his shoes on stone, the rustle of his clothes, the quick intake of his own breath. The snakes shifted with him, following, watching, but never striking. For the first time, he allowed himself to observe without panic. He noticed the way their scales caught the dim light, the rhythm of their movements, the subtle ways they communicated with each other through hisses and flicks of their tongues. Hours felt like minutes as he remained still, studying them. He began to whisper to himself, softly, reciting facts he had read in his books, patterns, and observations. He tried to reason, to imagine solutions, to find a way to communicate or at least coexist. His mind, trained for problem-solving and curiosity, became his shield. Fear was still there, sharp and gnawing, but he realized that panic would not help him. Knowledge, attention, and patience might. He remembered a small notebook in his pocket, the one he always carried, full of sketches and notes about plants, animals, and strange phenomena he had observed. He pulled it out cautiously, careful not to provoke the snakes. The creatures paused, as if sensing the change. He began to sketch quickly, noting the shapes of the snakes, their sizes, the patterns on their scales. He murmured explanations to himself, imagining that if he could understand them, he might survive. For the first time since he had been captured, he felt a small spark of hope. He wasn't just a helpless victim. He had a mind, a way to see and analyze, a capacity to notice what others might miss. Even here, in the terrifying depths of an alien snake dungeon, he could find patterns, small openings, possibilities. He realized that his nerdy, bookish habits so often mocked on Earth were suddenly his greatest assets. He sat down carefully, keeping an eye on the snakes, and opened his notebook. The light was dim, but it was enough to see his sketches. He began comparing the snake's movements to the patterns in his notes. He observed, hypothesized, and tested silently. He even whispered little theories aloud, watching the reactions. Slowly, cautiously, he began to feel a tiny sense of control, a feeling he hadn't experienced since being snatched from the forest dock. By the time night fully settled into the dungeon, he had stopped trembling entirely. The fear was still there, lurking, but it was no longer overwhelming. He had realized that even in the darkest, most dangerous places, curiosity and careful observation could give him power. He had discovered that intelligence and patience could be as strong as physical force. He wasn't free, not yet, but he had survived hours of terror using only his mind. And as he sat there, surrounded by the massive, coiling snakes and the alien captors who had thrown him into this place, he opened one of the pages of his notebook and began to read. It wasn't a textbook this time. It was a story, a novel he had tucked into his pocket before leaving home. He read quietly, softly, and for the first time in hours, he felt a strange calm. The creatures watched, silently, as if they too were listening. Intrigued by the sound of his voice in that moment, he understood something fundamental. Fear was powerful, yes, but curiosity, knowledge, and a quiet confidence of being true to yourself could be even stronger. And though he was trapped in a place no human had ever been before, he had found a way to survive. He had found a way to endure. The dungeon was terrifying, the snakes enormous and alien, but the human boy, the nerdy, bookish boy, was still alive. And in the hours ahead, that fact alone would become the key to everything that followed. The first night in the dungeon passed slowly, with the boy barely sleeping. Every sound, every hiss, every scrape of a scale against stone kept him alert. Even when exhaustion pressed on him, his mind refused to stop. He kept thinking, analyzing, remembering every detail from the forest capture to the strange movements of the snakes. He wondered why they hadn't attacked, why they circled him, but kept a cautious distance. Something about them suggested intelligence, maybe even curiosity. When the dim light of alien lamps shifted slightly, he realized he had to understand the place better. He cautiously rose from where he had been sitting and tested his legs. The cold stone under his feet made him wince, but he moved slowly, deliberately, trying to avoid startling the creatures. The massive snakes shifted as he stepped, their scales scraping faintly, but none lunged. The boy noticed small patterns in their behavior. When he moved too fast, they stiffened. When he stayed calm, they relaxed. He began to realize that fear was obvious to them, but calmness could confuse or even calm them in return. He remembered something from his favorite books. In strange worlds, observation was survival. He started paying attention to the smallest details of the dungeon. The walls were slick, but there were tiny grooves in the stone that suggested previous travelers or prisoners had walked here. Some areas seemed warmer, almost like faint heat rising from deep within the dungeon. There was moisture dripping from the ceiling, but it formed small puddles rather than flooding the floor, which suggested a natural pattern rather than chaotic design. He mentally noted all of this, piecing together a map in his mind. Hours passed as he explored cautiously. The snakes watched him from every corner, their glowing eyes following his movements. Occasionally, one would flick its tongue, tasting the air around him. He realized they weren't attacking because they were assessing him, trying to understand him. That thought gave him a strange mixture of fear and hope. If they were capable of understanding, maybe he could influence them. Maybe, somehow, he could use his brain, his natural curiosity and intelligence, to navigate this place alive. He began experimenting. He moved one hand slowly toward a nearby snake, making sure his motions were gentle and deliberate. The snake didn't strike. It only turned its head, its tongue flicking. He repeated the motion with different gestures, sometimes drawing shapes in the dust on the floor. Slowly, he noticed subtle reactions. A shift in the snake's gaze, a slight coiling change, a hiss that sounded different from the usual warning tone. His heart raced not with fear, but excitement. It felt like he had discovered a language he never knew existed. As he continued, he found a small, semi-hidden alcove in the dungeon, a niche in the wall where the stone formed a natural shelf. On the shelf were old papers, bits of worn cloth, and a small, dusty notebook. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. The notebook was written in alien symbols, but some shapes seemed familiar. They reminded him of patterns he had noticed in his science fiction books, loops, lines, repetitions. He didn't understand the language, but he understood the concept. Patterns conveyed meaning. He began copying the symbols onto the floor with a stick he found nearby, testing how the snakes reacted. At first, nothing happened. He adjusted, changed angles, made smaller loops, and suddenly, one of the snakes paused mid-coil, its glowing eyes fixed on the symbols. The boy's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just noticing. It was responding. He whispered to himself, trying to calm his own nerves. He knew that if he could keep them engaged, curious, or calm, he might survive longer. maybe even find a way out. Hours blurred as he experimented with gestures, symbols, and soft murmurs. The boy realized something profound. These creatures were like nothing he had ever faced, but they were also not purely dangerous. They were intelligent, observant, and cautious. And just like any other intelligent being, they could be influenced by patterns, calm behavior, and patience. This thought gave him a strange sense of empowerment. He also noticed other things in the dungeon. There were faint scratches on the walls, marks of previous visitors or captives, perhaps. There were small depressions in the floor, shallow enough that they might hold water. Little cracks in the stone formed hidden pathways that the snakes avoided. Everything was a clue. He felt a spark of hope. The dungeon, while terrifying, wasn't chaotic. It had rules, patterns, and where there are rules, there is understanding, and where there is understanding, there is survival. As he moved carefully through the dungeon, he discovered a tiny stream of water trickling from a rock crevice. He knelt and drank cautiously, feeling the cold liquid refresh his parched throat. The snakes seemed to notice, but didn't move toward him aggressively. The boy realized that small acts of survival, done calmly and carefully, could be done without provoking them. He felt a little more confident with each passing hour. Still, he was hungry and exhausted. His stomach rumbled, reminding him that his body needed energy. He searched the alcove and surrounding areas for anything edible, but found nothing. He reminded himself that panic would make matters worse. Hunger was dangerous, but careful observation and patience could guide him to resources, or at least keep him safe. He resolved to wait, to watch, to learn. Survival was not just about food, it was about understanding the world around him. He sat down again, cross-legged on the cold stone floor, and opened his notebook. He had drawn several new symbols on the floor, and the snakes occasionally responded, moving slightly, but never striking. He started sketching patterns in his notebook, noting the snakes' reactions and trying to understand the logic behind them. Each small observation gave him a sense of control. For the first time, he realized that even in a terrifying place, his brain, his intelligence and curiosity was more powerful than sheer fear. Time passed differently in the dungeon. Hours merged together. The boy learned to measure time by the movement of the snakes, the change in the air currents, and the dim shifts of the floating lights. Occasionally, he whispered softly to himself, repeating patterns, imagining he was talking to the creatures. It felt foolish at first, but slowly he realized that sound, too, could influence them. Calm, steady murmurs kept them curious rather than aggressive. Eventually, he remembered the small novel he had hidden in his pocket. It was a story he loved, full of adventure and imagination. Pulling it out quietly, he began to read under the dim light. The words, the rhythm, the calm of reading aloud seemed to have a surprising effect. The snakes gathered around, watching, coiling and uncoiling, but none approached aggressively. Their glowing eyes followed the movement of the pages and listened to the cadence of his voice. The boy felt a strange bond forming. By this point, fear was still present, sharp and alive, but it no longer controlled him. He had discovered that patience, curiosity, observation, and careful action could give him power, even in a world where he was physically weak. His heart beat steadily now, not with panic, but with cautious determination. He realized that he had the ability to survive here, not because of strength, but because of thought, intelligence, and care. He continued to read quietly, alternating with sketching symbols on the floor. The snakes, still massive and imposing, seemed calmer with each passing hour. He noticed that some of them even mirrored his movements slightly, turning their heads in rhythm with his gestures, flicking their tongues in patterns that echoed the shapes he drew. It was like a silent conversation, one conducted in shapes, movements, and calm sound. As the night deepened, he felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had survived hours in a dungeon with alien snakes, relying on his mind rather than brute force. He realized that fear was a tool, one that could be managed, understood, and even used to observe patterns in the world around him. Even though he was alone in a terrifying place, he had found control over his own reactions. Finally, as the dim alien light began to shift in ways that suggested the approach of a new cycle, maybe a new day, he allowed himself a small moment of pride. He had not just survived. He had learned. He had discovered the rhythms of the dungeon, the patterns of the snakes, and the subtle ways in which intelligence, patience, and calm could influence even the most alien and dangerous beings. The boy leaned back against the cold stone wall, notebook in hand, novel open, and felt a small spark of hope. He did not know what would come next. He did not know if he would ever escape. But he had discovered something even more important, that even in fear, knowledge, patience, and curiosity could become a lifeline. And in the hours ahead, those lifelines would be the key to his survival and the strange adventure that had only just begun. After spending the night observing and understanding the behavior of the alien snakes, the boy felt a small spark of courage within him. The terror from the previous day hadn't disappeared, but it had lessened. He realized that fear could be a guide if handled correctly. It told him when to move carefully and when to stay still, but it didn't have to control him completely. With this understanding, he decided he needed to explore further. He had to find out if there was a part of the dungeon that could provide safety, food, or at least more clues about what he was dealing with. He moved cautiously, one careful step at a time, keeping his hands raised slightly as a gesture of calmness. The massive snakes coiled and uncoiled around him, some watching closely, some stretching across the room in lazy arcs. He noticed that when he moved deliberately, they mirrored him, their flickering tongues and subtle movements reacting to his actions. It was a strange, almost hypnotic rhythm, and he realized that every movement he made sent a message to the creatures. Even in this frightening environment, he had influence through patience and observation. As he explored, he began to notice small irregularities in the dungeon walls, cracks, grooves, and faint indentations. It wasn't random. There was a pattern, almost like the dungeon had grown or been constructed with care. Some walls were smooth, while others had textures that could be used for climbing or hiding. He pressed his fingers against the cold stone and traced the grooves carefully, imagining that they might lead somewhere important. It was slow work, but he had time, and rushing would be dangerous. Eventually, he stumbled upon a small alcove, partially hidden behind a thick curtain of hanging moss. It was narrow, just wide enough for him to squeeze through, and the snakes didn't seem to notice it. The air inside was warmer and drier, and he could see the faint outline of objects tucked away in the shadows. With trembling hands, he stepped inside. The alcove was a strange, hidden space. Old remnants of previous visitors were scattered across the floor. Tattered papers with alien symbols, scraps of cloth, and a small, dusty notebook. His fingers brushed over the notebook, and he felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced since entering the dungeon. This was a discovery, a clue that the space had been used before. Perhaps others had been trapped here too. Perhaps some had survived or left behind instructions in their own way. He picked up the notebook carefully and examined it. The symbols inside were unlike anything he had seen. Yet some of the shapes reminded him of things he had studied in science fiction and pattern recognition exercises back on Earth. He couldn't read the language, but he could see structure. Loops repeated, lines intersected, and some symbols appeared in groups. Even without understanding the meaning, he realized that patterns existed and that patterns could convey information. That idea was powerful. It meant that even in a foreign and terrifying environment, logic and observation could be tools for survival. With renewed determination, he began experimenting. He drew shapes on the stone floor with a small stick he found in the alcove and watched the snake's reactions. At first, nothing seemed to happen. One massive serpent flicked its tongue, and then another slowly shifted closer. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he noticed the change. The snakes weren't aggressive. They were curious. The boy whispered softly to himself as he worked, repeating what he had observed. Calmness, careful gestures, patience. Slowly, the creatures began responding more consistently to his movements. Hissing softly rather than striking, the boy realized that he had stumbled upon something important: communication, even in the most alien and dangerous circumstances, was possible. It didn't require words. It required observation, patience, and intelligence. He felt a thrill of hope. Perhaps, by continuing to study the patterns of the dungeon and its creatures, he could survive longer than he had imagined. He could learn to navigate this place instead of being at the mercy of fear a lone dot. As he explored the alcove further, he discovered small piles of old papers, each covered in alien writing. Some were torn, others smudged, but each was a clue. He began copying symbols onto the stone floor, arranging them in sequences, and watching the reactions of the serpents. The process was slow, careful, and exhausting, but it was also fascinating. Each subtle movement, each flick of a tongue, each hiss carried meaning, and he became determined to understand that meaning. Hours passed, and he noticed that the alcove provided a measure of safety. The snakes rarely entered fully, and the space itself offered a small, hidden refuge. He could rest, even if briefly, without constant fear of being attacked. This small victory mattered. The boy realized that survival wasn't just about physical strength or speed. It was about finding safe spaces, observing patterns, and learning to influence the environment. Even as he rested, he kept his mind active. He began sketching the snakes, their shapes, movements, and patterns in his notebook. He created diagrams and notes, as if he were mapping an unknown ecosystem. Every observation he recorded added to his understanding and gave him confidence. He realized that he was no longer just a terrified boy trapped in a dungeon. He was a student of this strange, alien world, and that knowledge gave him a strange kind of power. Despite the small progress, he was aware that he was still in danger. The snakes were massive and could strike at any moment, and the alien captors who had brought him here were still watching. He had to be careful, patient, and observant at all times. One misstep, one moment of panic could be fatal. Yet for the first time, he felt a sense of control. Fear had not disappeared, but it was no longer paralyzing. Knowledge, observation, and cautious action had become his tools. The boy's mind wandered as he examined the alcove. He imagined who might have been here before him and how they had survived or failed. He wondered if they had discovered the same patterns, or if they had acted recklessly out of fear. He realized that his natural curiosity, his habit of studying and understanding, gave him an advantage that others might not have had. Where others would panic, he could observe. Where others would fight blindly, he could strategize. He spent some time tracing the grooves in the stone walls of the alcove, testing the reactions of the snakes to different movements. Slowly, he noticed that certain gestures caused the serpents to relax, coil back, or even shift away. It was a breakthrough. He realized that he could influence them without words, without aggression, simply by understanding their behavior and acting deliberately. The boy's heart pounded, not with fear, but with excitement. He had discovered a method to survive, even with this progress. Hunger and thirst reminded him that survival was more than observation. He searched the alcove for water, finding a small trickle that seeped through a crack in the stone. He drank carefully, savoring the cool liquid. It was a small victory, but it reminded him that patience and observation could lead to practical results. He realized that he needed to continue exploring, learning, and observing to find more sources of sustenance, hidden paths, or clues to escape. As the hours passed, he grew bolder. He began to sit in the alcove and read from his small novel. The words and the calm rhythm of reading aloud seemed to affect the serpents as well. Their movements slowed, their hisses softened, and some even appeared to listen attentively. The boy realized that his voice, his presence, and his calm behavior had become tools for survival. Even in a place as alien and dangerous as this dungeon, he could influence his surroundings. By the end of the day, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had survived not just through fear, but through intelligence, observation, and patience. He had discovered a hidden refuge, a safe space within the dungeon, and had begun to understand the behavior of the alien snakes. He had realized that even in the darkest, most terrifying situations, knowledge and calm could provide a lifeline. The boy leaned back against the cold stone, notebook in hand, novel open, and felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know what would happen next or if he would ever escape, but he had discovered something important, that survival in an alien, dangerous world was possible through observation, understanding, and patience. He had turned fear into a tool, curiosity into a weapon, and intelligence into a shield. For the first time since being captured, he felt a small sense of pride. He had found a hidden refuge, understood the patterns of his captors and the serpents, and discovered a way to influence his environment. The dungeon was still dangerous, the snakes still massive and imposing, but he had found a way to exist here without succumbing to panic. And as he sat there quietly, surrounded by the glowing eyes of the serpents and the dim alien light, he realized that the hidden alcove was more than just a safe space. It was a place of learning, understanding, and strategy. Here, he could survive, plan, and prepare for whatever challenges awaited him in the hours to come. By the time the boy had settled into the alcove, he had spent hours observing, studying, and quietly experimenting. The terror that had gripped him during his capture had not vanished, but it had transformed. It had become a sharp awareness, a guide that helped him move carefully, think clearly, and notice every detail. He realized that the dungeon and the alien snakes weren't just obstacles. They were a world to study, a puzzle to understand. Survival depended on knowledge, patience, and cleverness more than strength. Sitting cross-legged on the cold stone, he examined the symbols he had drawn on the floor the previous day. Each movement of the snakes, each flick of their tongues, seemed to carry meaning, and he wanted to understand it. He tested new gestures, slow, deliberate arcs and loops, and watched carefully. One of the larger snakes shifted slightly, uncoiling just a little and tilting its head as if paying attention. The boy's heart raced. It wasn't a lot, but it was a response, a tiny sign that communication, in some form, was possible. Encouraged, he experimented more. He noticed that the snakes responded differently to his voice and to his movements. Whispering softly, repeating rhythms he had read about in books, seemed to calm some of the serpents. Others were more reactive to shapes and motions, the loops and lines he traced in the dust or scratched on the stone floor with a stick. Slowly, he began to realize that each snake had its own personality, or at least its own patterns. Some were curious, some cautious, some impatient, but all could be observed and predicted. He tried combining his methods. He would trace a symbol on the floor and then speak softly, letting his voice rise and fall in a calm rhythm. One massive serpent, which had been hissing intermittently, paused and tilted its head. Another smaller one slithered closer, coiling near him, but keeping a respectful distance. The boy's mind raced with excitement. He realized that this wasn't just survival, it was interaction. He could influence them, even if only in small ways, and that gave him a confidence he hadn't felt since before his capture. His thoughts drifted briefly to home, and the life he had left behind. The world outside had always seemed ordinary, predictable, and often boring compared to the wonders he had read about. Now, here in the dungeon, everything was strange, frightening, and alive with possibility. He understood, in a deep way, that knowledge and observation were tools that worked in any world, human or alien. The habits that had once made him seem nerdy were now saving his life. The boy spent hours practicing these techniques, carefully noting the snake's reactions. He noticed patterns. Certain shapes caused the serpents to pause. Certain tones of his voice made them coil in particular ways, and subtle shifts in his posture could prevent aggression. Every experiment he conducted felt like learning a new language. He didn't understand words, but he understood signals, cause and effect, and behavior. It was exhausting work, both mentally and physically, but also thrilling. At one point, he realized that the alcove offered him a small advantage. Its walls partially blocked some of the larger snakes from reaching him, creating a natural barrier. He could move, sketch, and experiment with a bit more safety than in the open chamber. It became his workstation, a place where he could observe, test, and learn. He traced symbols, whispered softly, and carefully watched every flick of the tongue, every coil shift, and every hiss. As the day wore on, he noticed a subtle change in the snake's behavior. They were less tense, more curious, and some even mirrored his movements slightly. He realized that his careful observation and gentle interaction had begun to establish a sort of trust. It wasn't friendship, and it wasn't safe in the way he might have imagined, but it was understanding. The creatures recognized that he wasn't a threat, and he recognized patterns in them that he could use to avoid danger. He experimented further, trying to anticipate how the snakes would react to different gestures. He tested new symbols, combinations of loops and lines, and spoke in soft, measured tones. One large serpent paused in its movement, uncoiled fully, and tilted its head toward him for an unusually long time. The boy felt a thrill of discovery. This was more than observation. Now it was interaction. A subtle conversation conducted without words, through patterns, gestures, and sound. The boy began to understand that his survival depended not only on avoiding aggression, but on establishing this silent dialogue. Panic would undo everything. Calm, careful action would create opportunity. He repeated patterns, modified gestures, and watched reactions, slowly learning the rules of this strange, alien world. Each success, no matter how small, gave him more confidence. The fear was still there, sharp and real, but it no longer controlled him entirely. At one point, he noticed that one smaller snake had slithered closer than the others, almost like it was observing him personally. Its eyes followed every movement, its tongue flicking in rhythm with the sounds he made. He paused and studied it carefully, trying not to startle it. Slowly, deliberately, he traced a small symbol on the floor. The snake responded almost immediately, shifting its coil slightly and moving closer without aggression. The boy realized that he had achieved something important: influence. He could affect the behavior of these creatures in subtle ways. The boy spent the next hours experimenting with different approaches. Sometimes he focused on patterns and shapes on the floor, sometimes on tone and rhythm of his voice, and sometimes on posture and movement. The serpents responded differently to each method, and he learned to adapt. He discovered that the larger snakes were more sensitive to posture and gesture, while the smaller ones responded more to sound and rhythm. By combining these techniques, he could manage the behavior of several snakes at once. During this time, he also discovered more details about the dungeon itself. Small crevices, hidden passages, and natural alcoves provided both shelter and vantage points. Water trickled from narrow cracks in the walls, and tiny plants grew in the dampest areas. The dungeon was harsh, but it was not entirely lifeless. He began to notice details he had missed before: patterns in the stone and air currents, and even the way the snakes moved along particular paths. Every detail became part of his understanding, part of the silent dialogue he was building with the creatures. By evening, the boy felt a strange sense of calm. The alcove had become more than a hiding place. It was a workspace, a laboratory, and a place of learning. He had discovered that even in the most alien, dangerous circumstances, observation, patience, and intelligence could give him power. Fear was still present, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a tool, a guide, a reminder to act carefully and thoughtfully. He opened his notebook again and began sketching the patterns he had observed that day. He noted the behavior of each snake, the effects of gestures, and the reactions to different tones of voice. Every detail mattered. Each observation was a step toward mastery of the environment and survival. For the first time since his capture, he felt that he was not entirely powerless. The dungeon was dangerous, yes, but it was also predictable in ways that he could understand and influence. As the light in the dungeon dimmed, he picked up his small novel and began reading quietly. The sound of his voice, the calm rhythm of reading aloud, seemed to affect the serpents as well. They shifted less, coiled more calmly, and some even appeared to listen, tilting their heads in rhythm with his voice. It was a small victory, but it reinforced his growing confidence. He had discovered a form of influence through knowledge, observation, and subtle communication. By the end of the day, he leaned back against the cold stone wall, notebook in hand, novel open, and felt a small spark of pride. He had survived another day in the alien snake dungeon. He had discovered ways to communicate subtly, understand patterns, and establish a level of control over the creatures that surrounded him. He didn't know what would happen next, or if he would ever escape, but he had discovered a fundamental truth. Intelligence, patience, and careful observation could become tools for survival, even in the most frightening situations. The boy realized something else. The skills that had once made him nerdy in the eyes of others, his love of books, observation, and careful analysis were the very tools that were keeping him alive. In the alien dungeon, his mind was stronger than brute force. His calm, careful study of the snakes and their behavior had turned the dungeon from a purely dangerous trap into a place where he could survive, learn, and adapt. As he drifted into a light sleep, the serpents coiled quietly around the edges of the alcove. They did not attack, nor did they retreat fully. They watched, observing his movements even as he rested. The boy's mind, tired but alert, considered what he had learned today. Every interaction, every pattern, every gesture was a building block for the next step. He realized that he could not only survive, but possibly find a way to influence the creatures and eventually escape. And in that realization, he found something stronger than fear, hope. It was quiet, cautious hope, but it was real. He had learned that in a world filled with danger and alien creatures, knowledge, patience, and observation could become a lifeline. And as the night settled over the dungeon, he felt that tomorrow he would continue his experiments, deepen his understanding, and take another step toward survival and discovery. The boy had spent days, or at least what felt like days, in the alien snake dungeon. Time had become strange, measured by the subtle shifts in the glowing lights, the rhythm of the snake's movements, and the slow dripping of water in hidden cracks. He had learned to survive by observing patterns, using patience, and quietly experimenting with gestures, symbols, and soft speech. Every small interaction with the snakes had become a lesson in understanding, and he had begun to see that even the most alien and dangerous creatures could respond to intelligence and calm behavior. On this day, he felt a strange mix of anticipation and caution. He had discovered hidden alcoves, trickling water, and ways to influence the snakes, but he had not yet fully explored the extent of the dungeon. He knew there had to be more. The alcove he had claimed as a workspace was small and safe, but it could not hold him forever. He needed to explore, to map more of the space, and to find resources that might help him survive longer. He began by observing the snakes closely, noting how they moved, how they reacted to light, and how they interacted with each other. Some snakes were curious and bold, others cautious and defensive. He realized that each creature had its own behavior patterns, and understanding those patterns could give him control over the environment in ways he hadn't imagined before. He experimented, moving slowly across the floor, tracing symbols, speaking softly, and watching the responses. The snakes reacted predictably now, coiling or relaxing depending on his actions, and he felt a sense of cautious confidence. After several careful hours, he decided it was time to move beyond the alcove. He chose a path that seemed less traveled, a narrow corridor that ran along the edge of the chamber. The stone floor was uneven, and the air was thick and damp. He moved slowly, hand on the wall for guidance, watching every flick of a tongue, every hiss, and every movement of the glowing eyes around him. It was tense work, and his heart raced with every step, but he forced himself to remain calm. Panic would undo all the progress he had made. As he moved further, he noticed something unexpected. The dungeon was not just a random collection of tunnels and chambers. There were patterns in the walls, in the placement of the glowing lights, and even in the behavior of the snakes. Some areas were warmer, some colder. Some paths led to dead ends, while others had hidden passages. He realized that the dungeon itself was almost like a living organism, with its own rules and rhythms. Understanding those rules could be as important as understanding the snakes themselves. He paused at a small intersection of tunnels, studying the space carefully. One of the larger snakes coiled nearby, watching him with glowing eyes. He stayed perfectly still, breathing slowly, and spoke softly, whispering in a calm rhythm. The snake's body relaxed slightly, and he took it as a sign that he could proceed. Slowly, deliberately, he moved forward, mapping the corridors in his mind and noting subtle details, cracks in the walls, faint echoes of dripping water, and patterns of airflow that suggested larger spaces beyond. Hours passed as he continued this careful exploration. He found small pockets of hidden water, shallow depressions that could hold moisture, and even small plants growing in the dampest corners. Each discovery was a small victory, and he carefully documented it in his notebook. He realized that the dungeon, while dangerous, had resources if he knew where to look. Observation and intelligence had become his tools, turning fear into opportunity. During his exploration, he encountered a cluster of snakes blocking a narrow passage. Their bodies coiled tightly, eyes glowing, tongues flicking in synchronized rhythm. His first instinct was to retreat, but he remembered what he had learned. Fear would make them aggressive. Calmness and observation could influence them. He stood still, whispered softly, and traced a pattern on the ground with a stick. Slowly, the snakes shifted, creating a narrow path that allowed him to pass. It was a small but significant victory, reinforcing his belief that understanding and patience could shape the environment, even in ways that seemed impossible. He continued down the passage, deeper into the dungeon, and discovered a small chamber he hadn't noticed before. The walls were covered with faint carvings, symbols similar to those he had seen in the old notebook in the alcove. Some of the carvings were intricate, looping and twisting in ways that seemed almost alive. He realized that others, creatures, or visitors long ago had left these markings, perhaps as a form of communication or record-keeping. He carefully sketched the symbols in his notebook, studying their patterns and considering how they might relate to the behavior of the snakes. While examining the carvings, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. A smaller snake, different from the others, slithered toward him. Its movements were deliberate, almost cautious, but it didn't hiss or coil aggressively. He spoke softly, slowly tracing a pattern on the floor, and watched as the creature responded. It coiled back slightly, but did not retreat fully, as if testing him. He realized he was being observed, not just by the snakes, but by something more intelligent, more aware of his presence. His heart raced, but he stayed calm. Patience and careful observation had gotten him this far. They would continue to be his tools. He spent hours in that chamber, experimenting with gestures, symbols, and tones of voice. The smaller snake responded consistently, mirroring some of his movements and adjusting its position according to the patterns he traced. It was subtle, but it was real. He realized that he was building a form of understanding, a silent communication with the creatures. It was not friendship, not in the way humans understood it, but it was influence. And influence in this place was power, perhaps even a path to survival. By late evening, he felt a strange sense of accomplishment. He had explored new areas of the dungeon, discovered hidden chambers and resources, and learned to influence the behavior of the snakes in meaningful ways. The fear that had once dominated him was still present, but it had transformed into a sharp awareness, a guide for careful movement and thoughtful action. He had become a student of this alien world, learning its patterns, understanding its dangers, and discovering its hidden opportunities. As he rested in the small chamber, he pulled out his notebook and began documenting everything he had observed that day. He sketched the corridors, the alcoves, the placement of the snakes, and the subtle changes in their behavior. Every detail mattered, and each observation increased his sense of control. He realized that knowledge was more powerful than fear, more reliable than brute force. It was the tool that had kept him alive and would continue to do so in the hours to come. Even as he wrote, he could hear the faint hissing and shifting of the snakes outside the chamber. Their presence was constant, a reminder of the danger that surrounded him. But he no longer felt helpless. He had discovered that his calm, patient observation and subtle gestures could influence them. He had found a way to coexist, at least temporarily, with creatures that were far stronger and more imposing than himself. Finally, he opened his small novel and began reading quietly. The sound of his voice, calm and steady, seemed to affect the snakes in a subtle way. They shifted less, coiled more gently, and some even appeared to listen, their heads tilting in rhythm with his words. Reading aloud became more than comfort. It became a tool, a way to maintain calm and influence the environment. He realized that even in a place filled with danger, knowledge, patience, and careful action could create moments of control and stability. By the end of the day, he leaned back against the cold stone wall, notebook in hand, novel open, and felt a flicker of hope. He had explored new areas, discovered hidden resources, and learned to communicate subtly with the alien snakes. The dungeon was still dangerous, but he had found a way to exist within it, to survive, and even to influence the world around him. For the first time since his capture, he felt a sense of pride. His careful observation, intelligence, and patience had become his greatest tools. Fear was still present, but it no longer controlled him. Knowledge had become his weapon, his shield, and his path forward. He had discovered that even in the darkest, most alien places, survival was possible for those willing to observe, learn, and act wisely. And as he drifted into a light sleep, surrounded by the glowing eyes of the serpents and the faint alien light, he realized that tomorrow he would continue his exploration, deepen his understanding, and take another step toward survival. He had learned that intelligence, patience, and observation could turn even the most terrifying circumstances into opportunities. The boy had spent countless hours in the alien snake dungeon. Days, or what felt like days, had blurred together as he observed, experimented, and learned. Each moment had been a lesson in patience, intelligence, and calm observation. By now, he understood the behavior of the snakes in ways he could never have imagined when he was first thrown into the dungeon. Fear was still there, sharp and real, but it no longer ruled him. It had become a guide, a warning system that kept him alert while his mind worked to turn danger into opportunity. He had explored many hidden passages, found trickles of water, and discovered alcoves where he could rest safely. He had traced symbols on the floor, whispered in calm tones, and seen the serpents respond in subtle but meaningful ways. He had built a silent dialogue with these alien creatures, a form of communication without words, based on observation, patterns, and careful gestures. And now he felt ready for something more ambitious. He wanted to understand the dungeon as a whole, to find a larger space, or perhaps even a way out. He rose early, moving carefully along the corridors he had mapped in his mind. The snakes watched him as always, but their reactions had changed over time. Some coiled less tightly, others mirrored his movements with almost playful curiosity. He realized that his repeated demonstrations of calm behavior and careful observation had earned a measure of trust, or at least understanding. It was not friendship, and he knew better than to assume it was, but it was something he could work with. The boy followed a narrow corridor that had always seemed quieter than the others. He moved slowly, touching the walls lightly to maintain balance, and watched every subtle movement of the snakes. One smaller serpent slithered ahead of him, flicking its tongue as if guiding him. He smiled faintly, realizing that he could influence even their movement through careful observation and consistency in his gestures. Each step was deliberate, each breath measured, and he felt a growing sense of control. After some time, he entered a larger chamber he had not explored before. The ceiling was high, the walls lined with strange carvings, and the faint glow of alien light reflected off the polished stone floor. At first, he froze. This was unlike any other part of the dungeon he had seen. The snakes coiled along the edges, their eyes tracking his movements. But he reminded himself to stay calm. Fear had never been his ally. Observation had. Slowly, he stepped forward, noting the patterns of movement among the serpents and the faint vibrations in the air that hinted at hidden passages. In the center of the chamber, he noticed a raised platform, covered with alien symbols similar to those he had studied in his notebook. He approached carefully, tracing the symbols with his fingers. Something about them seemed almost like a map directions, perhaps, or instructions left by previous visitors. He studied them meticulously, trying to understand the logic, the sequence, the patterns. Hours passed, and he slowly pieced together a possible route through the chamber, noting areas where snakes coiled, areas where paths were narrow, and areas where he could move safely. As he experimented with his movement across the chamber, he discovered that his presence, combined with gestures and soft tones of voice, influenced the serpents more than he had ever realized. Some followed him, not aggressively, but as if curious about his actions. Others moved aside, coiling back just enough to create space. It was a revelation. He could navigate the chamber using the tools he had developed over the day's observation, calm gestures, and subtle communication. The dungeon was still dangerous, but he had discovered a way to coexist within it, to move through it without provoking unnecessary aggression. He paused near a wall and noticed a faint draft of air, cooler than the rest of the chamber. Following it carefully, he traced a narrow passage hidden behind a row of massive coiled snakes. He whispered softly, tracing symbols on the ground, and the snakes shifted just enough to create a path. His heart pounded. It was a delicate dance, but he had learned the rhythm. Slowly, he moved forward, step by step, testing the space, listening to every hiss, every movement, every shift in the air. The passage led to a smaller chamber, surprisingly open and less populated with snakes. In the center was a shallow pool of water, clear and fresh. The boy knelt and drank, savoring the cold liquid. It was a small victory, but it reminded him that patience and observation could lead to tangible rewards. He rested briefly, sketching the passage and the snake's positions in his notebook. Every detail mattered, every observation was valuable, and he felt a growing sense of accomplishment. He realized that he had survived longer than anyone could have expected simply by being careful. Patient and intelligent. As he explored further, he discovered something remarkable, a series of small alcoves leading up a gentle incline, forming a kind of staircase that seemed to rise toward the upper levels of the dungeon. He tested each step carefully, observing the snake's behavior, noting where paths were clear, and adjusting his movements. Slowly, deliberately, he climbed higher, following the rhythm he had learned from the creatures and the environment itself. It was exhausting, but he felt a growing sense of hope. Perhaps this was the path to freedom, or at least a safer area. Reaching the top of the incline, he found a narrow corridor that opened into an enormous chamber. Light filtered in from openings above, faint and diffuse, casting patterns on the floor. The chamber was massive, more open than any he had encountered. The snakes were fewer here, and their movements were slower, almost indifferent. The boy felt a thrill of discovery. This was different, a space that felt like a threshold, a place where he could breathe and think without constant fear. He moved cautiously into the center, tracing the patterns on the floor, whispering softly and observing the snakes. One massive serpent, the largest he had encountered, coiled at the far edge, watching him intently. He froze, heart pounding, and remembered everything he had learned: calmness, patience, observation, subtle gestures. Slowly, he raised a hand in a non-threatening gesture, then traced a symbol on the floor. The serpent tilted its head, uncoiled slightly, and stepped back. He exhaled softly. It was a small victory, but it mattered. Exploring the chamber further, he noticed that the light above revealed faint textures in the wall's natural grooves that might lead to an exit. He approached carefully, testing the stone, noting the snake's reactions, and tracing patterns on the floor. Each step was deliberate, cautious, but confident. He had learned to move in this world, to navigate it, and to influence the creatures around him without aggression. Survival had become a skill, honed over days of careful observation and intelligence. Finally, he reached the far side of the chamber and noticed a faint glow, brighter than the ambient light. He stepped closer and discovered a small opening, just large enough for him to squeeze through. Beyond it was a slope that led upward, away from the dungeon. His heart raced. Could this be the way out? He tested the area carefully, listening to every hiss, observing every movement. The serpents near the opening remained calm, almost indifferent, and he realized that his careful study and communication had allowed him to pass without incident. He crawled through the narrow opening, pulling himself upward along the slope. The light grew stronger, warmer, and he felt the air change, less damp, less heavy. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of anticipation, of progress. He continued, step by careful step, until he emerged into a small cavern at the surface. Sunlight filtered in faintly from above, casting golden patterns on the stone floor. He looked around in awe. This was freedom, or at least the threshold of it. For a moment, he simply sat, letting the warmth of the light wash over him. The dungeon below was still dangerous, filled with massive alien snakes, but he had survived. He had learned, observed, experimented, and influenced. His mind, intelligence, and patience had carried him through. The fear that had once ruled him had become a tool, guiding him carefully without paralyzing him. And now, standing at the edge of the surface, he realized that survival was not just about escaping. It was about understanding, adapting, and using knowledge in a world that was unlike anything he had known. He glanced back at the small opening that led down to the dungeon. The serpents would remain below, coiled in their chambers, but he had learned enough to navigate safely in their presence. The boy knew that the dungeon, the snakes, and the alien environment had taught him something vital. Intelligence, patience, and observation were stronger than fear. They could guide him, protect him, and ultimately lead him to freedom. Finally, he took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the surface air, and stepped forward. Each movement was deliberate, calm, and confident. He had survived the alien snake dungeon, not by brute force, but by using his mind, observing patterns, and quietly communicating with the creatures around him. And as he moved toward the light, he felt a sense of hope and possibility stronger than he had ever known. The dungeon was behind him, but the lessons it had taught him would stay with him forever.